Have you ever watched someone be completely wrong about you and chosen to say nothing? Not because you
Let me fix
couldn't,
that for you.
because you were
Be my
waiting
guest.
for exactly the
There,
right moment.
perfect.
Thanks, you always know.
Brian Thompson walked into the Hollywood on a Tuesday night in December with a woman on his arm who was not his wife, and a smile that could have powered every chandelier above him. He adjusted the lapels of his Brioni tuxedo, custom-cut charcoal wool, the kind of suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and leaned close to the woman beside him. "This is where legends are made, babe. Stay close. Act expensive." Ashley Thomas, 26 years old, squeezed into a red dress so tight it looked spray-painted on, let out a squeal that made three nearby socialites rotate in unison toward the source of the disturbance. He had a $5,000 invitation in his breast pocket, and the unshakable conviction that the universe had finally, after years of struggle and hustle and brilliance, recognized what he was. He believed the invitation was evidence. He believed the room crystal chandeliers, white-gloved waitstaff, the soft, expensive laughter of New York's wealthiest moving in clusters was a room he had earned his way into through sheer intelligence and iron will. He was wrong about all of it. The invitation was a leash. The woman who sent it was holding the other end from a locked room at the end of a hallway in a house in Greenwich, Connecticut, a room Brian believed was storage filled with her dead father's tax files and old furniture nobody wanted. The woman he had left at home that evening, 7 months pregnant, was not the broken and simple housewife he had spent 5 years convincing her she was. She owned the hotel he was standing in. She owned the bank holding his mortgage. She owned every dollar that had ever passed through his venture capital firm, routed through an architecture of shell companies so intricate it had taken a team of forensic accountants 3 months just to map the outer edges of it. And she had hired exactly that team. But to understand what was about to happen in that ballroom, to understand why a sapphire worth $12 million was going to blaze under those chandeliers before the night was over, you have to go back. Back 6 years to a diner on Wayne Avenue in Dayton, Ohio, on the morning after a funeral where a 27-year-old woman sat alone in a cracked vinyl booth and made the most dangerous decision of her life. The coffee in front of Laura Clark had gone cold 2 hours ago. She hadn't touched it. She was wearing her father's flannel shirt, blue plaid, faded at the elbows, smelling faintly of engine grease and the Old Spice he'd worn every day for 40 years, and she was staring at her own reflection in the rain-streaked window of Mel's diner like she was trying to recognize a stranger. Joseph Davis had been buried the day before. To the people of Dayton, Joseph was the best mechanic in Montgomery County, the kind of man who could diagnose what was wrong with an engine by putting his ear close and listening the way a doctor listens to a chest. He never charged widows full price. He kept a jar of hard candy on the counter for children whose parents brought cars in for repair. He had raised Laura alone after her mother died of an aneurysm when Laura was 11, and he had done it without complaint and without self-pity, working 6 days a week and coaching her soccer team on Saturdays and reading to her every night until she was old enough to tell him it was embarrassing. And even then, he kept doing it when she was sick. What the people of Dayton did not know was that in 1979, Joseph Davis, 24 years old and working the floor of a small machine shop in Cincinnati, had solved a problem with fuel injection efficiency that engineers at 3 major automotive companies had been trying to crack for a decade. He patented it quietly, the way he did most things. He licensed it broadly across dozens of manufacturers and then went back to his garage in Dayton and kept charging fair prices and listening to engines and putting candy in the jar on the counter. By the time he died of a heart attack at 61, that patent lived inside roughly 60% of every combustion engine on the planet. Joseph Davis left his daughter $4.1 billion managed through a holding company called the Meridian Group, run by a man named Kenneth Lee, CEO of the largest private investment bank in Philadelphia. Methodical and loyal and so discreet, he had once gone 6 months without telling his own wife he'd been named to a presidential advisory council because the appointment was under a confidentiality agreement. Laura sat in that booth the morning after the funeral, and her phone rang. It was the attorney for her former fiancé, the man who had spent 14 months telling her she was the love of his life, and then 3 days after discovering the actual scope of what was in her father's estate, transferred $1.8 million out of her personal account and fled to the Cayman Islands. The attorney's voice was smooth in the way of things that have been practiced until the seams don't show. "My client believes a quiet resolution would benefit both parties, Ms. Clark. He's prepared to be generous." Laura hung up without speaking. She looked at her reflection in the rain on the glass. She saw a woman who had been betrayed by the first man she trusted with her whole self, whose father was gone, whose mother was a memory, and whose money had become a kind of curse, the thing that made every relationship a transaction before it had a chance to become anything else. She picked up the phone and called Kenneth Lee. "Kenneth." Her voice was steady, in the way things are steady when the worst has already happened, and the shaking comes later. "I want to disappear, create a new background, move all operations to remote management. Laura Clark, the heiress, ends today." A pause on the line, Kenneth processing. "And who replaces her, Ms. Clark?" She looked at the cold coffee. "Nobody special, just a regular woman, someone a man could love without checking the math first." That night she called her grandmother. Margaret Wilson was 72 at the time, living in the same house on Grafton Avenue where she had raised Joseph Sharp as a well-kept blade and about as easy to argue with. When Laura told her what she was planning, the disappearance, the new life, the test, Margaret was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then, "Baby, if you want to test a man, don't watch how he treats you when you're shining. Watch how he treats you when you're struggling. That's the only test that matters." Laura pressed the phone to her ear and held it there long after they said goodbye, as if she could keep her grandmother's voice from fading. She moved to Westport, Connecticut 3 weeks later. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery on Post Road, accessible by an outdoor staircase that iced over in February and smelled permanently of cinnamon and yeast. She bought jeans from the clearance rack at the Westport Target. She drove a 2011 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper that she'd gotten from a parking lot in Bridgeport and never bothered to fix. She took a job waitressing at a restaurant called Harlow's Bistro on Main Street, a place she secretly owned through 3 layers of corporate intermediary, a fact that caused her a quiet and specific kind of irony every time she clocked in. She was not hiding. She was watching. She met Brian Thompson on a Wednesday morning in March at a coffee shop called Anchor and Bean, where she had stopped for a medium oat milk latte on the way to her shift. He was sitting 2 tables away working on a laptop, and he looked up when she walked in, not in the calculating way some men look up, cataloging, measuring, but with the uncomplicated attention of someone who has noticed something good happening nearby. He was 32, dark-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that came from having spent his whole life being found charming without having to try too hard for it. He remembered her order on the second visit without being told. On the third, he had it waiting. On the fourth, he asked if she wanted to walk after, and she said yes, and they walked for 2 hours along the post road and then along the water, talking about everything and nothing, and she found herself laughing at something. He said a real laugh, not the managed careful laugh she'd gotten used to deploying, and she noticed it because it surprised her. On their third proper date, they were walking back from dinner when an elderly woman coming out of a convenience store on Main Street lost her grip on 2 paper bags at once. Cans of soup and vegetable broth rolled into the street. The woman made a small sound of distress. Brian didn't hesitate, didn't look at Laura first to gauge the situation. He just moved, crossing to the woman in 4 quick strides, gathering every can from the asphalt, picking up the bags, walking her the half-block to where her car was parked, loading everything into the back seat, and declining the $5 bill she held out to him with a shake of his head and a warmth that looked entirely unperformed. He came back with a slightly sheepish expression. "Sorry about that. Couldn't just walk past, you know." That was the moment. Not because the gesture was large, it wasn't, but because of how unremarkable it seemed to him, as if kindness were his resting state, as if the only question had been which direction to walk. Laura would replay that 15 seconds 1,000 times over the next 5 years, turning it in her hands like a stone, trying to understand how the man who jogged across the street to help a stranger with her groceries had become the man who stood in the doorway of their bedroom and told his 7 months pregnant wife she looked like a whale. They married 18 months after the coffee shop. Laura told Brian she had a modest inheritance from her father, enough to put something toward a house. What she actually did was purchase the house outright through a holding entity called Orion Acquisitions, then construct a simulated mortgage that Brian believed he was servicing with the profits from his new venture capital operation, Thompson Capital Group. The firm was Brian's idea, Brian's dream, his proof, as he described it more than once, that he was somebody who could build something real from nothing. What Brian did not know, every investor who came through Thompson Capital's door, every client who signed an engagement letter, every term sheet and deal memo and wire transfer had been quietly engineered by the Meridian Group through a web of intermediary entities with names like Vega Holdings and Orion Acquisitions. Kenneth Lee's team had seeded the firm's deal flow with enough legitimate-looking transactions that even a competent forensic accountant would need months to trace the source. Laura had done all of it because she loved him. She wanted him to feel like a man who had built something. She wanted him to have the confidence of someone whose success was real. She gave him the architecture of an accomplished life because she believed in that first year, in that season of Friday flowers and Sunday dinners, and the way he called her "my girl" with something that sounded unmistakably like he meant it, that he was worth building for. She did not anticipate that the man she was building for would eventually become something the building itself had helped create. But what nobody watching from the outside, what nobody in that house ever fully sees, is the way erosion works. It is not an earthquake. It does not announce itself. It is water, finding the path of least resistance, moving through stone so slowly that by the time you notice the canyon, you cannot remember what the landscape looked like before. Year one was almost exactly what she had hoped for. He brought flowers on Fridays, not expensive ones, gas station carnations, sometimes diner counter roses, and the gesture was more in the bringing than in what he brought. He cooked Sunday dinners badly and with great enthusiasm, burning onions and oversalting pasta, and presenting both disasters with the satisfaction of a craftsman who believes in his work. He called her his girl. He wrapped his arms around her from behind when she was at the kitchen sink and pressed his mouth to the side of her neck and said things like, "How did I get this lucky?" in a voice so quiet it was almost to himself, and she believed he meant it. Year 2 introduced the first fracture so small she almost didn't notice it. They were getting ready for a dinner at the home of one of Brian's new business contacts, a man named George White, who ran a competing firm and who Brian both envied and needed to impress. And Laura came downstairs in a blue dress she'd bought that afternoon, something simple and well cut that she liked for the way it made her feel put together without trying too hard. Brian looked at her for a moment that lasted one beat too long. Something shifted behind his eyes, not cruelty, yet something earlier than cruelty, something more like the first draft of it. "Is that what you're wearing? It's a little plain, don't you think? You've been looking kind of, I don't know, soft lately." She went upstairs and changed. She told herself it was feedback. She told herself couples give each other feedback. That was normal. That was being close to someone. She would tell herself that for 3 more years. Year 3, the feedback became a current running through everything. He stopped saying please. He stopped saying thank you. The Sunday dinners stopped. He was too busy. The company was growing. He had things to do on weekends. The flowers stopped. He started referring to the house as his house and the car as his car, even though Laura had paid for both through accounts he didn't know existed. "You don't contribute, Laura. You waitress part-time and you putter around this house. I'm the one building something real. I'm the one with the vision. You should be grateful I keep you around." She heard those words and filed them somewhere very deep in the place where things go when you're not ready to look at them directly. Year 4, the cruelty stopped being occasional and became the weather of the house. He came home late Tuesday nights, especially always Tuesday nights, and the expensive smell of a woman's perfume that was not Laura's came in with him. When she asked where he'd been, he turned a look on her so saturated with contempt that she felt herself physically compress like something being squeezed. "I was working, Laura, working something you wouldn't understand because you've never built anything in your life. Now, make me something to eat. I'm starving." But what nobody tells you about the kind of relationship that diminishes you slowly, what the people who haven't been inside one cannot understand, is that staying does not mean weakness. Staying inside that house took an extraordinary amount of strength. The wrong kind of strength turned inward, burning through you quietly from the inside. It takes more out of you than leaving does. It cost Laura more to remain standing in that kitchen making his dinner than it would have cost her to walk out the front door, and she knew it. And she stayed anyway because she kept waiting for the man from the coffee shop to come back, because she had been watching him for 4 years, and she still had not given up on the idea that he was still in there, somewhere underneath whatever the money and the validation and the unchecked vanity had buried him under. She was wrong, but she would not know that for another year. Year 5, he hired Ashley Thomas. Ashley was 26, blonde, built for the kind of attention she'd been getting since high school, with a communications degree from a state university in Indiana, and a talent Laura would come to recognize with clinical clarity, the talent of locating what a powerful man most wants to hear about himself and saying it back to him in slightly different words. Brian hired her as his executive assistant at Thompson Capital, and within 6 weeks, she was answering his personal phone, and within 10, she was meeting him at the St. Regis Hotel on 55th Street every Tuesday afternoon, while Brian told Laura he was in board meetings. Laura knew she had always had access to the financial records, every corporate card statement, every bank ledger, every GPS log from the vehicle she leased through Vega Holdings. She watched the hotel charges appear on the card like clockwork. She watched a $12,500 Cartier diamond pendant get entered into the company's expense records under the line item Computer Hardware Server Upgrade. She watched Brian take Ashley to Disney World for what the travel receipts described as a Business Development Conference Chicago Board of Trade. She watched all of it. She documented all of it. And she felt her heart break in a manner so gradual and so complete that by the time there was nothing left to break, she could barely locate the place where it had been. But what nobody in that room knew, what Brian had absolutely no idea, was that the woman he was systematically dismantling had been in contact with a former FBI financial crime specialist named Anthony Wilson for 11 of those months. Anthony had retired from the Bureau's Philadelphia field office 4 years earlier and now ran a small private investigations firm out of a second-floor office in Midtown Manhattan, handling white-collar cases that required someone who knew how shell corporations worked from the inside. Laura had found him through a referral from Kenneth Lee, whose bank had used Anthony's firm to support 2 previous fraud investigations. Their first meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Anthony had looked at the preliminary documents. Laura brought the doctored expense records, the forged corporate filings, the tissue of lies that Brian had been weaving into the Meridian Group's money for almost 2 years, and said, "Ms. Clark, you don't just have a bad husband, you have a federal case. The question is whether you want to build it properly." She said yes. He spent the next 6 months building the bridge to Special Agent Stephanie Heiress at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in New York. And by the time Laura made the phone call that would set the Gala in motion, she had been a cooperating witness under federal investigation for 18 months. But before she made that call, she had to get through Thanksgiving. She was 6 months pregnant. She woke at 5 in the morning on a cold November Thursday and spent the entire day in the kitchen working with the focused deliberateness of someone who is trying to make something mean, something it probably cannot mean anymore. Turkey with sage stuffing, homemade cranberry sauce that took 40 minutes of careful stirring, green bean casserole, and sweet potato pie made from the recipe Brian's mother had kept on a handwritten index card, the recipe he'd told Laura about on their second date, saying it tasted like being a kid in Trenton before everything got complicated. She set the table with the good china, the set they'd received as a wedding gift and almost never used. She lit candles, real ones, pillar candles that smelled like cedar. She put on the nicest maternity dress she owned, a soft green knit that had somehow survived the indignity of being both comfortable and presentable. She placed Brian's favorite bourbon at the head of the table with one large ice cube, exactly how he took it. He came home at 9:15. The turkey was cold. The candles had burned a quarter of the way down. The ice cube had dissolved into a puddle of diluted whiskey. He stood in the doorway of the dining room, looked at the table, and wrinkled his nose. "I already ate. The team had dinner at Nobu. You know, I can't eat this heavy stuff, Laura. It's so pedestrian." She kept her voice even. "I made your mother's sweet potato pie. You said it was your favorite." He loosened his tie with a single sharp pull. That was before I developed an actual palate. Throw all of it away and clean this up. The house smells like a school cafeteria." He went upstairs without looking at her belly, without asking about the baby, without saying Happy Thanksgiving. The silence he left behind was particular. It was not the silence of an empty room, it was the silence of a room where something had just been decided. Laura sat down at the table. She picked up a fork. She ate her Thanksgiving dinner alone, the full plate slowly course by course, while tears fell into the sweet potato pie she had spent 3 hours making because she had wanted to give him something with the texture of home. She ate because she was pregnant and the baby needed her to eat. She ate because she refused to let him take even that from her. Later that night, lying on the living room couch, because she could not stand to be in the same bed as him, she called Melissa Thompson, her closest friend, since their freshman year at UConn, now a pediatric nurse at Bridgeport Hospital, a woman constitutionally incapable of softening a truth she thought you needed to hear. "Pack a bag and come to my apartment tonight. I'll make up the guest room." "I'm 6 months pregnant, Melissa. I can't just leave." "Laura." The name alone was a full sentence. When someone shows you who they are, the actual first time you're supposed to believe them, you've given him 5 years of second chances. That's not love anymore. That's a hostage situation. 2 more weeks. The gala is in 2 weeks. After that, it's over. I promise. Melissa was quiet for a long time. Then, "I swear to God, if that man does anything to you or that baby, I will burn his life down myself. And I don't need $1 billion to do it." 1 week before the gala, Laura asked Brian to come with her to her final prenatal appointment. It was the last ultrasound before the birth, the last image she would have of her daughter before her daughter was a person in the world. "I have a meeting," he said, not looking up from his phone. "A real one, with actual important people." She went alone. Dr. Sandra Anderson was thorough and warm, the kind of doctor who understood that pregnancy happens to a whole human being and not just a body. The baby was healthy, strong heartbeat, good position, everything exactly where it should be. Then Dr. Anderson's expression shifted just slightly. "Laura, I'm noticing elevated blood pressure. Have you been under unusual stress lately?" Something gave way in Laura, not a collapse, not a breakdown, just a quiet interior giving way, like a load-bearing wall developing its first hairline fracture. The tears came in waves. She sat on the exam table in her paper gown with the ultrasound gel cooling on her stomach, and she could not stop them. Dr. Anderson held her hand and waited without speaking, which was exactly the right thing to do. When the worst of it had passed, the doctor asked, "I need to ask you something honestly, Laura. Is everything okay at home?" She opened her mouth. The truth was right there. She could feel it pressing against the inside of her teeth, aching to be said. But 5 years of practiced silence had made silence into muscle memory. "I'm fine. It's just hormones." She gathered herself, dressed, and walked through the parking lot toward the Civic. That was when she saw the Mercedes. Brian's silver E-Class was parked across the street from the medical building in front of a cheesecake factory. Through the restaurant window, under the warm amber light, she could see him clearly. He was in a booth. Ashley Thomas was across from him, laughing at something he'd said, her body angled toward him, in the particular way of someone who has arranged themselves to be seen as well as to see. Brian reached across the table and fed her a bite of dessert from his fork. Then his hand moved down. He placed it on Ashley's stomach, open palm gentle, the slow circular motion of a man who is registering something miraculous underneath his hand. Ashley Thomas was pregnant. Laura stood in the November rain, 7 months along, and watched her husband touch another woman's belly with the tenderness he had never once turned in her direction. She had asked him to feel the baby kick. He had said he was busy. She had placed his hand on her stomach while he was half asleep. He had rolled away from her and pulled the sheets back over himself. He had not touched her belly once in 7 months. Not once. She stood in the rain until her coat was soaked through, and then she stood a little longer. She called Margaret. The voice that came out of her was barely a voice at all, thin and small, in a way she had not heard herself sound since she was 12 years old and had to be told about her mother. "Grandma, she's pregnant. Ashley is pregnant." Across 1,000 miles of phone line, the clock on Margaret's kitchen wall ticked steadily into the silence between them. "Lord have mercy," Margaret said finally. "How far along?" 3 months, maybe. He was rubbing her belly, Grandma. He has never once touched mine. Not once in 7 months. Margaret Wilson took a breath. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of iron that has been worked in fire until it holds exactly the shape it needs to hold and will not be persuaded to become anything else. Vivian Marie. She caught herself, the old name a reflex from a very old habit, then steadied. "Laura, you listen to me. You are going to that gala. You are going to walk into that room and show that man exactly what he has been throwing away. And then you are coming home to me, and we are going to raise that grandbaby of mine with so much love she will never know for a single day of her life what it feels like to be cold. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." "And baby, wear the blue dress, the one with the diamonds. Let him see what a real queen looks like." 3 weeks earlier, after the dinner, where she had placed the ultrasound photo in the small envelope beside Brian's plate, and he had looked at it and said, "I hope she gets your looks because my genes are wasted on someone who's just going to end up as a housewife anyway," and gone upstairs without mentioning the baby again. Laura had picked up the encrypted phone she kept in a false-bottomed compartment behind the washing machine. The phone that connected to Kenneth Lee and to Anthony Wilson and to the architecture of the thing she had been quietly building for 18 months, and she had made a call. "Kenneth, the Diamond Gala, when is it this year?" "December 14th. "Ms. Clark, invitations went out last week. Send one to Brian. Make it look like it came from the event committee. VIP table near the front." She paused. "Move the board presentation to that night. I want the full forensic audit ready. Gary Young, Jennifer Williams, everyone. Ms. Clark." Kenneth's voice was careful in the way of a man who is measuring something before he speaks. "Are you certain?" She looked at the ultrasound photo still sitting on the dining room table next to Brian's half-eaten dinner and the candles that had melted into pools of hardened wax. "My daughter is not going to be born into a lie." The night before the gala, Brian came home drunk at midnight. Laura was in bed propped on 3 pillows because sleeping any other way had become impossible, reading a book of baby names with a pencil. She had circled Clara. She liked the way it sounded, clear, direct, a name that would hold up under the weight of a full life. Brian stood in the bedroom doorway. The expression on his face when he looked at her was not complicated. It was a pure and simple disgust, the kind that does not bother to arrange itself into something more socially acceptable, and it hit her like something physical. "God, Laura, you look like a whale." I can't even look at you anymore. I'm carrying your daughter, Brian. Are you sure it's mine? Let's be honest, I haven't touched you in months. Who knows what you do when I'm at work? The inversion of it was so precise, it stole her breath for a moment. The man who spent every Tuesday afternoon at the St. Regis was accusing his faithful 7 months pregnant wife of infidelity with a confidence that suggested he had rehearsed it. He sat on the edge of the bed, working off his shoes, and said it the way he might mention a change in their cable subscription. After the baby's born, we need to talk about the future. I want a different life. The company's going through changes. I might need to restructure things at home, too. He was telling her he would leave her after she gave birth, after she had served her purpose. He had already decided. Where would I go, Brian? She kept her voice very small, which cost her something she did not have a name for. I have nothing. You control everything. He smiled in the dark. His teeth caught the light from the hallway. Exactly. So maybe try being a little more grateful. He was asleep in 4 minutes. Laura lay awake in the dark until the sky outside began to lighten at the edges, that particular pre-dawn gray that is neither night nor morning, but the borderland between them, with one hand resting on the curve of her belly, feeling her daughter move against her palm. The baby was awake. She had been awake for most of the night, shifting and pressing outward, as if she could sense the change in the atmosphere, the slight recalibration of everything that was happening in the room around her. Laura whispered to her in the dark, "Tomorrow, sweetheart, tomorrow your mother stops pretending." When the first gray light made the room visible, she got up. She walked to the end of the hallway to the door Brian believed was storage, full of her dead father's tax records and old furniture, and nothing worth opening for. She keyed in the 6-digit code and heard the lock disengage. She pushed the door open. Inside, 3 monitors glowing with real-time financial feeds. A secure communication terminal Kenneth's team had installed while Brian was on a business trip to Miami. A wall of organized files color-coded by date and subject, representing 18 months of meticulous documentation, and, hanging from a padded hook under a breathable garment bag, the dress. Midnight blue silk, hand-stitched along the bodice with crushed diamonds so small they were barely visible individually, but caught light collectively and threw it back in a dozen directions at once. It had been designed specifically for her body at this stage of this pregnancy, by a woman in Philadelphia who had spent 3 decades making clothes for people who needed to walk into a room and change its atmosphere. Beside the dress, a jewelry case. Inside, the Ashby blue. The necklace had been in her family for 3 generations. Sapphire at its center, the color of deep water, in good light, surrounded by diamonds in an arrangement her great-grandmother had commissioned in 1942. Appraised most recently at $12 million. Joseph Davis had kept it in a safety deposit box at a bank in downtown Dayton, and he had told Laura, once she was maybe 17, sitting on the floor of his garage, watching him rebuild a carburetor, that she would know when to wear it. "You'll know because you'll be done being small," he'd said, not looking up from the work in his hands. "Wear it then." She touched the sapphire, cold against her fingertip, the way stones hold cold even in a warm room. "I'm done being small," she said to the empty room. Downstairs, 3 floors below, and 6 miles away, Brian Thompson was beginning to get ready for the best night of his life. He had no idea it was the last night of the life he'd invented. The morning of the gala arrived, the way difficult mornings often do quietly without ceremony. the pale December light pressing against the bedroom curtains as if testing whether it was welcome. Laura had been awake since 2. Not the anxious wakefulness of someone who cannot quiet their mind, but the particular alertness of someone who has been preparing for something for a very long time and can feel the hour of it finally arriving in their chest. She was sitting on the edge of the bed when the first call came in at 6:43, Kenneth Lee's name on the encrypted phone screen, his voice carrying the specific register he reserved for situations that had moved beyond his capacity to manage quietly. "Miss Clark, we have a problem. A board member security is still in the process of confirming identity, but we believe it's someone in the Chicago satellite office has made contact with a financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The journalist has been asking questions about Meridian's ownership structure, detailed questions, the kind that suggest someone gave them a map." He paused. If that story runs before tonight's presentation, Brian sees it. He panics. He either destroys documentation, or he moves money we haven't finished tracing, or he leaves the country. We lose 18 months of work. Laura stood up from the bed and walked to the window. The street below was empty and frost-edged, the kind of quiet that belongs to early December mornings in Connecticut, when the rest of the world hasn't started yet. She watched a single car move through the intersection at the end of the block and disappear. "Kill it," she said. "Pay the journalist whatever an exclusive post-gala interview is worth to them. Frame it as access the full story directly from me on my timeline. That story does not run before I'm standing at that podium." A beat. "Yes, Miss Clark." "The forged loan documents is Gary Young ready? Everything is in the folio, page 4 as you requested." She ended the call and stood in the window for exactly 30 seconds. Then the second phone rang. Melissa, from the nail salon on Main Street, her voice pitched lower than usual, the way voices drop when the information being transmitted is the kind you don't want to say too loudly. I just ran into Ashley Thomas. She was at the salon getting her nails done, and she was loud, like she wanted to be overheard loud. She was telling 2 women she's never met in her life that Brian is filing for divorce on Monday morning. His lawyer told her, "You get nothing because you have no income. They think you're destitute, They think you have literally nothing." Melissa stopped. "They're going to try to take the house." Laura absorbed this. Ashley had been told, which meant Brian had told her, had sat down with his attorney and his pregnant girlfriend and laid out the plan with enough confidence to let it become salon conversation. He was not just leaving. He had choreographed the exit. He had already decided what shape her nothing would take. The third call came 9 minutes later from Jennifer Williams, Laura's attorney, speaking in the measured cadence of someone delivering information they have verified 3 times before picking up the phone. "Mrs. Clark Thompson, I need to inform you that a $500,000 home equity loan was filed against your Greenwich property yesterday. The signature on the application is yours. Our handwriting analyst has confirmed it is a forgery, a good one, but a forgery. The funds were wired the same day to a title company in Stamford. The deed on the receiving property, a 2-bedroom condominium on Broad Street, has been recorded in the name of Ashley Thomas." 3 catastrophes in 45 minutes. The journalist threatened the timing of the reveal. The divorce filing threatened the legal architecture she'd built to protect herself. And the forged signature was a federal crime that, if discovered through conventional channels before tonight, would collapse her cover at the exact moment it needed to hold. From the bathroom down the hall came the sound of Brian Thompson singing. An actual song, something current and upbeat about making the most of your life. His voice carrying through the door with the unself-conscious pleasure of a man who believes his morning is unfolding exactly as it should. Happy, confident, completely sealed inside a version of events in which he was the protagonist and everything was going according to plan. Laura called Kenneth back. "The journalist handle it tonight, not tomorrow. The exclusive interview happens after I step off that stage. Make sure they understand they're getting the story nobody else will have." She moved to the door of the room, listening to Brian sing through the wall. The forged signature goes into Gary's folio as a separate exhibit. Jennifer gets a copy by 2 o'clock. She ended the call and opened her contact list and found Melissa. "I need you at the Harlow tonight. Not as my friend, I mean yes, as my friend, but also as the one person in that room I trust who isn't on my payroll. Back table near the exit. If something goes sideways before I reach the podium, you'll know what to do." Melissa didn't pause. "I'll be there. And Laura, I have been waiting for this night for 4 years. I am going to be so well dressed." Brian emerged from the bathroom in a cloud of expensive steam, his tuxedo already on the Brioni jacket, hanging open while he worked the onyx cufflinks, the good ones, Laura's words for them, because they had been a gift, though not from her, into his French cuffs. He positioned himself in front of the full-length mirror and tilted his head left, then right, checking his angles with the focus of a man auditioning for his own reflection. He did not look at Laura, who was sitting on the edge of the bed in a cotton robe, watching him with an expression he would have found unreadable if he had thought to look. "Where are those cufflinks, the onyx ones?" It was not really a question. "On the dresser," Laura said, "right where you left them." He found them, snapped them into place, checked the Rolex she had given him for their 5th anniversary, the one he told people he'd bought himself with a Christmas bonus from a deal that closed in January, a deal she now knew had been funded entirely through Vega Holdings. He checked the watch and said still to his reflection, "I'll be late. Don't wait up. And make sure whoever cleans the library this week actually dusts the shelves. I found a fingerprint on the reading lamp last Thursday." He picked up his coat from the chair by the door. He walked out. The front door closed. The picture frames on the staircase wall shivered with the impact. A brief tremor, and then the house went still. Laura sat on the bed for a moment, in the silence. Then she untied the robe and stood up. She walked down the hall to the door at the end, the one Brian had never once tried to open in 5 years, because she had told him it was full of her father's old tax documentation and estate files, and because he had never cared enough about anything belonging to her dead father to investigate further. She entered the 6-digit code. The lock released. Inside, 3 monitors displaying Meridian's real-time financial feeds, the numbers steady and green, the secure communication terminal, the wall of documented evidence organized by date, hotel charges, corporate card statements, GPS records, the forged expense entries, the wire transfer confirmations from the Stamford condo transaction. 18 months of meticulous, patient, federally supervised construction. And the dress. She put it on carefully, the midnight blue silk settling around her body in the way things settle when they have been made specifically for the shape they're covering. The crushed diamonds caught the overhead light and scattered it. She stood in front of the small mirror mounted above the terminal and looked at herself, 7 months pregnant, dark hair loose around her shoulders, the woman who had been told she was nothing standing in a room that contained proof of exactly how much she was. She opened the jewelry case and lifted the Ashby blue from its velvet bed and fastened it at her throat. Cold against her skin, then warming. She held the sapphire once between her fingers, felt its weight, and let it rest. Melissa arrived at 4 with a garment bag. She didn't need any more, a professional makeup kit borrowed from a friend who did regional theater, and 2 bottles of sparkling cider wrapped in a dish towel. "I would have brought champagne," she announced, setting everything on the kitchen counter. "But you're pregnant and I'm driving, so we're toasting the complete destruction of your husband's constructed reality, like civilized women with fancy grape juice." She helped with Laura's hair, pinning it in a high sweep that left her neck bare for the necklace, working with the focused competence of someone who is performing an act of love and knows it. When Laura opened the jewelry case, Melissa went completely still. She stared at the necklace for a long moment without speaking. "Is that real?" It wasn't quite a question. "It's been in my family since 1942, Laura said. Melissa reached out and touched one of the surrounding diamonds very lightly, as if checking whether it would dissolve. "I have been lending you $20 for lunch," she said finally. $20, Laura, for 5 years. I need you to understand that I am emotionally processing several things right now." Laura laughed, a real one, the kind she hadn't produced in long enough that it felt like rediscovering a room in a house you'd forgotten existed. She video-called Margaret from the kitchen, turning slowly so her grandmother could see the full effect of the dress, the necklace, the high sweep of her hair. On the small screen, Margaret sat in the same kitchen chair she'd sat in for 40 years in the house on Grafton Avenue, wearing the cardigan she wore when she was trying not to show how much something mattered. She watched Laura turn. She didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was carrying something heavy. "Oh, baby girl, your daddy would cry if he could see you right now." Laura felt her throat close briefly. "I'm scared, Grandma." Margaret straightened in her chair, and the thing that moved through her face was not reassurance. Exactly. It was something older and more reliable than reassurance. "Good. Brave people are always scared. Cowards are the ones who feel nothing. Now you go show that man what he's been throwing away. And you call me the second you're off that stage. I don't care what time it is. I am not sleeping tonight." While Laura was preparing, Brian was already at the Harlow Hotel, working the room with the specific energy of a man who needs to be seen by the right people and hasn't secured that yet. He arrived at 6:30 with Ashley on his arm. She had charged the red dress to the Thompson Capital corporate card, and the Cartier necklace that sparkled at her throat had been entered in the company ledger as a server infrastructure upgrade. He navigated the ballroom with the confidence of someone who believes his invitation is proof of belonging, and found George White in a cluster of older men near the east wall. George was the kind of man who had succeeded long enough that he no longer needed to perform success. He wore it the way comfortable people wear old shoes without thinking about it. He looked at Brian's entrance, absorbed Ashley's presence at his side, and let a measured expression settle over his face that contained, if you read it carefully, a quality not unlike pity. "Brian, didn't think you'd made this list." "I have my connections," Brian said, with the particular laugh of a man covering uncertainty. "This is Ashley." "Charmed," George said, barely redirecting his attention. "We were discussing the Meridian Group. Word is the owner is finally stepping out tonight." Brian waved a hand. "The Meridian Group is probably some retired banker hiding money behind shell companies. The whole operation is a ghost. No face means no real power." Nearby, a man Brian had not properly registered turned slowly toward him. Timothy Clark, former two-term senator from Connecticut, in his early 70s, the kind of wealth that had stopped needing to make itself visible sometime around the second decade. He regarded Brian the way a man looks at something that has arrived in the wrong place. "I'd be careful with speculation like that, son. The Meridian Group owns this hotel and the bank that holds your mortgage in all likelihood." Brian laughed, the overconfident laugh of someone who doesn't know he's already lost the exchange. "I know finance, sir. A company without a public face has no real leverage." Timothy Clark looked at him for one more beat, then turned back to his conversation. George smiled into his champagne glass. "By the way, where's your wife tonight, Laura, was it?" Brian rolled his eyes in a way that was apparently meant to communicate world weariness. "Laura's at home. She's not really built for this world. Sweet woman, but very simple, thinks a grocery store wine is sophisticated dining." He pulled Ashley closer, squeezing her waist. "I need someone who can keep up. You know how it is." At a table near the back of the room, Anthony Wilson stood with a glass of sparkling water, listening. He noted the statement. He noted the confidence. He noted the particular variety of man who mistakes the absence of visible consequence for safety. At precisely 8 o'clock, the chandeliers dimmed. 500 separate conversations ended with the abruptness of a conductor's downbeat, that instant of collective silence that happens in large rooms when something is about to begin, and everyone present understands it simultaneously. A single spotlight found the marble staircase at the far end of the ballroom, illuminating the steps in a column of white light that turned the pale stone almost luminous. The master of ceremonies crossed to the microphone, a known face, a voice that had introduced presidents and closing arguments with equal gravity, and the room attended. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the 50th Annual Diamond Gala. Tonight marks a significant occasion. For decades, the Meridian Group has funded hospitals, scholarship programs, and cultural institutions across this country from a position of deliberate privacy. Tonight, the chairwoman has decided to step into the light." He paused, and the pause was its own kind of announcement. "Please welcome the owner and chairwoman of the Meridian Group, Madam Laura Clark." The champagne glass left Brian's fingers before his conscious mind had finished processing what he'd just heard. It hit the marble floor and shattered, and the sound of it was swallowed entirely by the breath that moved through 500 people like a single exhalation, that particular collective sound of an audience realizing something they were not prepared for. Clark. That was Laura's maiden name, but that was impossible. Her father had been a mechanic. Brian had met him. He had seen the grease under his fingernails, had eaten his barbecue on a back porch in Dayton, had listened to the man talk about carburetor timing with the enthusiasm of someone who had never wanted for more than what his hands could make. The double doors at the top of the staircase opened. She stood in them for a moment, and the moment was long enough to be intentional. The midnight blue silk moved as she exhaled the crushed diamonds, catching the spotlight and returning it in fragments that tracked across the walls and the ceiling and the faces of the people watching. The ashby blue burned at her throat. $12 million of crystallized inheritance, 3 generations of a family's most important object, and the fulfillment of a promise her father had made her without knowing exactly what he was promising. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was the most commanding presence in the room, and those two facts were not in tension. She began to descend. Each step was measured, each footfall on the marble deliberate. She moved like a woman who owns the ground she's crossing, which, as it happened, she literally did, down to the substructure and the mortgage and the loan that financed the renovation of the lobby 4 years ago. The crowd did not exactly part, it reorganized instinctively, the way rooms reorganize around things that have changed their center of gravity. 500 of the city's wealthiest and most connected people stepped back and let her through, and she walked the length of that opened corridor without looking left or right, her eyes fixed on one point in the room. Brian stood where he'd been standing when the glass fell, his face cycling through states too rapidly for any single one to establish itself. The slot machine of a man whose entire understanding of his situation is being revised in real time. Ashley tugged at his sleeve. "Why does she look like your wife? Like an upgraded version?" George White, still close enough to hear, permitted himself the smallest smile he had used in months. "I believe, Brian, that's the simple housewife you left at home." Laura stopped 10 feet from where Brian was standing. 4 security personnel flanked her. Kenneth Lee stood at her right, in a charcoal suit, holding nothing, needing nothing. Gary Young stood at her left, a leather portfolio under his arm that he held with the careful gravity of a man who understands what's inside it. Anthony Wilson had moved to a position near the side entrance, visible to Laura, invisible to Brian. A microphone was placed in her hand. The smile that crossed her face was slow and precise, and contained no warmth whatsoever. It was the expression of a woman who has been underestimated by the same person for 5 consecutive years and has spent the last 18 months deciding what to do about it. Her voice, when it came, was clear enough to reach every corner of the room without effort. "Welcome, everyone. I apologize for my lateness. I had some garbage to take out before I could attend." Her eyes did not leave Brian's face. She turned briefly to address Timothy Clark, a small correction about a real estate acquisition in New England that Kenneth had flagged, and Clark inclined his head with the ease of a man acknowledging a peer. "Think nothing of it, Madam Clark. Your judgment on these matters is not something we question." Brian watched a former United States Senator defer to his housewife, and something in his chest began to fracture along seams he hadn't known were there. Laura returned to the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, the ballroom so quiet now that the words simply existed in the air without having to work for space. "For the past 5 years I have been conducting what you might call a social experiment. I wanted to know whether a man could love a woman for who she was not for what she owned. So I hid my identity. I became a housewife. I let my husband believe he was leading." She pressed a button on the small remote in her left hand, and the enormous screen behind the podium came alive. A corporate flowchart materialized in high resolution. At the apex, the Meridian Group. Below it, a branching architecture of shell entities: Orion Acquisitions, Vega Holdings, 7 subsidiary structures flowing downward in connected nodes until the diagram reached its lowest point, where a single box sat attached to the rest by a thread that looked almost embarrassingly thin compared to the infrastructure above it. The box read, Thompson Capital Group. My husband Brian believed he was a self-made venture capitalist, Laura said. Every dollar in his firm came from me. Every investor, every client, every term sheet routed through this architecture. I was his only source of income, his only investor, his only client. He has been negotiating deals with my lawyers for 3 years without knowing it. Brian was on his feet. That is a lie. I closed a $2 million tech deal out of Boston last month. Real money, real counterparties. Laura pressed the button again. A bank statement replaced the flowchart, clean, dated, annotated. The Boston transaction was funded by Vega Holdings, she said. You were negotiating with my attorneys, Brian. I had professionals in that room. You were too busy demonstrating your watch to notice they spoke very little. The room made a sound, not laughter, yet something before laughter, the sharp intake that precedes it. The screen moved on. The St. Regis Hotel charges itemized by Tuesday, 17 of them over the past 5 months. The Cartier pendant receipt with its falsified ledger entry. And then a photograph Brian and Ashley at Walt Disney World, each wearing a set of Mickey Mouse ears, the castle visible behind them, the caption in the company expense system, reading, Business Development, Chicago Board of Trade. The room broke. It was not the polished, mannered amusement of people who are pretending to be amused. It was genuine collective. The sound a room full of people makes when the joke is complete and they have permission to respond to it fully. Gary Young stepped forward with the loan documents, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone reading facts into a record. This is a home equity loan for $500,000, filed yesterday against the marital residence in Greenwich, using a forged signature. The funds were transferred the same day to a title company in Stamford, Connecticut. The receiving property is currently deeded to Miss Ashley Thomas. He turned toward Ashley, whose hand had already gone to the necklace at her throat. That necklace you're wearing, Miss Thomas, it was purchased with a corporate card registered to a Meridian subsidiary whose sole designated purpose is funding nutrition programs for children in the Mississippi Delta. You are currently wearing a community's food assistance budget as jewelry. Ashley's hands went to the clasp. She was pulling at it before Gary had finished speaking, her voice rising in a register that did not belong to performance. Get it off me. He told me he was self-made. He showed me papers. He said they were separated. He said she was unstable. He is self-made, Laura said, and the quiet in her voice made the words land harder than volume would have. He made himself into a criminal. Gary held up the final document, a birth certificate, the paper yellowed at the edges, the county seal of Mercer County, New Jersey, visible in the upper right corner. The man we have been calling Brian Thompson was born Brian Allen Russo in Trenton, New Jersey. The name change was legally filed 7 years ago. Prior to establishing Thompson Capital Group, Brian Allen Russo was a junior shift supervisor at a car rental agency in Princeton, terminated following an internal investigation into personal use of fleet vehicles on weekends. The borrowed suit, the borrowed name, the borrowed life. 3 FBI agents entered through the service door on the south wall, moving with the economy of people who have done this enough times that it no longer requires performance. The lead agent crossed to Brian with a directness that made the intervening crowd reorganize itself again, this time away from rather than toward. Brian Allen Russo, you are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and forgery. As the handcuffs closed, Brian's voice broke across the room in a register Laura had never heard from him before, raw and fractured and stripped of every layer of cultivation he had spent years applying. "I loved you, Eleanor. I loved you in my own way." He used the wrong name. In the extremity of the moment, with everything stripped away, he called her by a name that wasn't hers, some composite of panic and guilt and the strange intimacy of a lie held for years. Or perhaps in some chamber of him she had never been able to reach. He had always known she was someone else entirely. Laura did not answer. She reached up to the clasp of the Ashby blue and unfastened it slowly, then held the necklace up by one end so the sapphire swung once in the light of the chandeliers. "You didn't love me, Brian. You loved the version of yourself you could see reflected in what I owned. But the mirror is broken now." The double doors at the far end of the room absorbed the agents and their charge, and closed, and the room erupted in applause that was not the polished, ritualized applause of a fundraising gala, but something rawer, the sound of an audience that has witnessed something they will be describing for the rest of their lives. For 48 hours it was unambiguous. Laura was home in Greenwich by 10:30, feet elevated on the couch, an ice pack on her swollen ankles, watching the coverage accumulate on 3 different cable networks, while Melissa sat beside her with herbal tea and an expression of profound satisfaction. The gala footage had been uploaded by 6 different attendees within 20 minutes of Brian's arrest and had crossed 100 million views across platforms before midnight. The photograph of him in the Mickey Mouse ears became a template. The forensic presentation had been auto-tuned into a song. A late-night host devoted his entire monologue to what he called the most overdue corporate restructuring in New York history. Laura watched the coverage and rubbed her belly and felt her daughter moving inside her with the steady, emphatic quality of someone registering approval. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence of the house felt like something chosen rather than something imposed. Then Melissa's phone buzzed. The color drained from Melissa's face in a single visible drop, like someone had pulled a plug. She looked at the screen, then at Laura. "You need to see this." It was a video posted from the county jail. Ashley Thomas, mascara-tracked orange jumpsuit, a cellmate's phone, providing the shaky footage. Ashley was crying with an intensity that could have been genuine or could have been performed, and the distinction no longer mattered because the effect was identical either way. "She ruined my life. I'm pregnant and alone. Brian told me she was abusive. He showed me divorce papers. He said they'd been separated for 2 years. He lied to me too. And now I'm sitting in a jail cell because a billionaire wanted her movie moment." Ashley looked directly into the phone camera. She could have left any time she wanted. She had all the money in the world. She chose to watch us suffer for 5 years so she could have her big reveal. Is that a hero? What about my baby? Does my baby not matter to anyone? 14 million views, 6 hours. The narrative turned with the speed of a rip current and in approximately the same direction. By morning, the headline architecture had shifted from celebration to interrogation. One prominent opinion columnist published a piece titled "The Problem with Billionaire Justice" that described Laura as a woman who had treated human beings like game pieces. Talk show panels debated whether the gala reveal had been catharsis or cruelty. Comments across every platform surfaced the same question in dozens of variations. She had $4 billion. Couldn't she have just left? Laura sat on her bed, scrolling through them, hand on her belly. watching the world she had believed was finally set right come apart at the seams for the second time in 72 hours. Melissa took the phone away from her. "These people don't know what he did to you." "But they're not completely wrong," Laura said, and her voice was smaller than it had been even in the worst years of the marriage. "I could have left 5 years ago, Melissa. What kind of person stays to build a trap?" Margaret called from Dayton, her voice carrying through the phone with the particular authority of someone who does not have time for false comfort. "Baby girl, since when do we care what strangers on the internet decide about things they weren't in the room for? You know who you are. I know who you are. That baby you're carrying knows who you are. Everyone else can manage their own opinions." A pause. "Let me tell you something I learned the hard way. When you fight a monster, the crowd cheers. The second you win, they start asking if you fought too clean. Women have been apologizing for being strong since before I was born. It stops with you." But the public reversal was not, as it turned out, the actual threat. That arrived 30 minutes later in a call from Kenneth, whose voice had gone to the register he used only when the situation had moved entirely outside his ability to absorb. "Ms. Clark, please sit down. Brian's attorney, a man named Ronald Sanchez out of a firm in White Plains, has filed 3 emergency motions in the past 2 hours. Kenneth laid them out with the precision of a man who had verified every word before dialing. "First, an entrapment claim. Sanchez is arguing that you deliberately funded and enabled Brian's fraudulent activity in order to engineer a federal prosecution which could constitute conspiracy. Second, a custody petition. Brian is seeking full legal and physical custody of your unborn daughter on the grounds that you are psychologically unfit and used your pregnancy as a theatrical prop in a public spectacle. Third, a countersuit for $50 million alleging fraudulent inducement of marriage through identity concealment." The room tilted. Not physically, but in the way the mind processes information that reconfigures everything around it, the way a familiar room looks different when you're told something terrible happened there. Laura gripped the edge of the mattress. The baby kicked hard once, as if registering the change in her body's atmosphere. "He wants custody of Clara." Her voice was quiet. "He cannot take my daughter, Kenneth." "He won't," Kenneth said with a steadiness she needed to believe and mostly did. "But, Ms. Clark, this is no longer about what happened at the gala. This is about survival." She spent 3 days in what Melissa would later refer to as the dark place. She didn't eat properly. She slept in intervals. She spent long stretches sitting in the nursery she had been quietly assembling for months. Pale yellow walls, a white crib with adjustable sides, a mobile of small felt birds she had made herself during the evenings when Brian was out and she had needed something to do with her hands. In the corner was a stuffed elephant she'd bought at a farmer's market in October because it reminded her of one her father had given her when she was 5, which she had carried everywhere until it fell apart. She sat in the glider chair and held her belly and talked to Clara in the dark. "I was supposed to be smarter than this," she whispered. "I was supposed to protect you. And now he might be able to take you because I was too proud to just quietly walk away. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Melissa found her there on the 3rd morning. She sat down on the floor with her back against the crib, folded her legs, and didn't say anything for a while. Just sat. Then, "Stop. Right now." Laura looked at her. "You are not losing this baby, Laura. Not over my dead body. Not over Margaret's dead body. Not over Kenneth Lee's extremely composed and professionally impeccable dead body. So stop grieving something that has not happened Tell me what we actually have." Something moved through Laura's eyes, not the cold calculation of the Gala, not strategy, something more animal and more urgent than either. The specific ferocity of a woman whose child is being threatened and who has just been reminded that she is not out of weapons. She picked up the encrypted phone. "Emergency meeting. Full team. 1 hour." They assembled via secure video. Kenneth from his Philadelphia office, Gary Young from Midtown, Jennifer Williams from her conference room in Stamford, and Anthony Wilson, who had been expecting the call and had a cup of coffee already in hand when he joined. Special Agent Stephanie Heiress of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division joined last from a room that gave nothing away about where she was. "The entrapment claim," Laura said. She had stopped shaking. Her voice had the quality of something that has been refined by pressure into a harder material than it started as. "It collapses the moment we establish that I was operating under federal supervision. Kenneth I need the complete communication record with Agent Harris's office compiled and filed with the court before noon tomorrow. Every email, every meeting summary, every timestamp." Kenneth nodded. "We have 147 documented exchanges with the Bureau over the 18-month period, already in preparation." Agent Heiress leaned slightly forward. "I can testify that Ms. Clark approached us voluntarily with evidence of financial irregularities in her husband's firm. We directed her to continue monitoring under our supervision while we built the case. Everything she did was within the authorized scope of the investigation." "The custody claim," Laura continued. "What do we need?" Jennifer Williams had been waiting for this, a character witness, someone who can speak to your fitness as a mother and your reasons for concealing your identity, someone the family court will trust without reservation, not a professional, not someone on your payroll, someone the judge will look at and simply believe. Laura was quiet for a moment. Then she felt something settle in her chest, the particular settling of a decision that was obvious the moment she let herself see it clearly. "Get my grandmother on a plane," she said. The hearing was set for the following Thursday in a family court in Stamford, Connecticut, on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of recycled air and old carpet and the specific institutional neutrality of spaces where people's lives are decided by strangers. The hallway outside the courtroom was lined with reporters who had been there since 7 in the morning, held back by a temporary barrier that a bailiff monitored with the patience of a man who had stood between cameras and proceedings for 20 years and had developed his own philosophy about both. Laura arrived with Jennifer Williams at 8:45. She wore a dark navy dress, not the gala dress, not anything that could be read as performance, and her father's watch on her left wrist, the second hand moving with its steady mechanical tick against her pulse point. She had not slept well, but she had slept, which was more than she'd managed in the 3 days prior. Melissa walked beside her. Margaret Wilson, who had flown in from Dayton on a Tuesday afternoon flight that Kenneth had arranged and that Margaret had accepted without fanfare, announcing only that she would need an aisle seat because of her hip, and that someone should have coffee, waiting at the gate, came through the courthouse door on her cane, wearing a floral dress, and her good church hat, moving at the deliberate pace of a woman who has learned that arriving slowly is not the same as arriving uncertain. Brian appeared on a screen mounted to the left of the bench, transmitted from the correctional facility in Westchester County, where he was being held pending trial. He wore the standard issue khaki of pre-trial detention and had the particular look of a man who has spent several days discovering that the version of himself he had constructed over years does not survive contact with institutional fluorescent lighting. Ronald Sanchez sat at the respondent's table in a well-cut gray suit, a yellow legal pad in front of him, covered in handwriting so small and dense it looked like a topographical map. Sanchez was good. Laura had researched him the moment his name appeared on the filings, and good was the accurate word. He had won custody cases for clients whose behavior made Brian's look almost moderate. He understood that family court ran on narrative, and he had spent the past 5 days building one. Judge Karen Martinez entered, and the room stood. She was in her mid-50s, with the compressed attention of someone who had been hearing these cases long enough to have developed a near-perfect internal instrument for detecting when she was being managed. She settled herself, reviewed the papers before her without expression, and nodded to counsel to proceed. Sanchez opened with the architecture of the argument he'd been assembling since the filing. Reasonable, measured, built for a judge rather than a jury, each sentence positioned to sound like reluctant acknowledgement of uncomfortable facts rather than advocacy. Your Honor, we are not disputing the federal charges against my client. We are not asking this court to adjudicate the financial misconduct alleged in those proceedings. What we are asking is narrower, and we would argue more fundamental. For the entire duration of this marriage, 5 years, my client's wife maintained a false identity. She concealed from him who she was, what she owned, and how she had structured their shared financial life. She allowed him to believe he had built something through his own efforts, and she watched with full knowledge and full resources as the situation deteriorated for years without intervention. A woman capable of that sustained, deliberate deception is not, we submit, a person who should be the primary custodial parent of a newborn child. He paused, the pause calibrated. The court should also note that this woman chose to make her revelation at a public event attended by 500 people, while 7 months pregnant, in a manner specifically designed to maximize humiliation. That choice tells us something about her judgment. Jennifer Williams rose. Your Honor, the petitioner would like to call a character witness, Margaret Wilson, the respondent's maternal grandmother. Margaret stood from the gallery bench and made her way to the witness stand with the unhurried movement of someone for whom hurrying had been optional for some years now. She settled into the chair, adjusted her posture, and looked at the room with the mild, alert expression of a woman who has outlasted more difficult things than this and knows it. She took the oath. She folded her hands in her lap. Sanchez approached. He began carefully acknowledging her age, her relationship to Laura, establishing the parameters before tightening them. Mrs. Wilson, isn't it true that your granddaughter concealed her financial identity from her husband for the entirety of their marriage? Margaret looked at him in the way she might look at someone who had just made a claim she found both factually incomplete and morally insufficient. Young man, she said, and the 2 words alone reorganized the atmosphere in the room. My granddaughter watched her first fiancé steal $1.8 million from her personal accounts and disappear to the Cayman Islands the week after he discovered what her father had left her. Before that, she watched 2 different men propose to her within weeks of finding out her net worth. One of them asked for a joint bank account before he'd returned the ring box to his jacket pocket. Margaret tilted her head slightly in the manner of a teacher waiting for a student to locate the obvious. So yes, she hid who she was, because she wanted one man, just one, to look at her and see a woman he wanted to spend his life with and not a number he wanted access to. That's not deception, counselor. That is self-preservation. And if you cannot distinguish between the two, I feel genuinely sorry for everyone in your personal life. A sound moved through the gallery, not laughter, something more involuntary than laughter, the audible response of an audience that has just heard the exact right thing said at the exact right moment. Sanchez waited for it to pass. He adjusted his approach with the agility of someone who has learned not to fight the current but to redirect it. Mrs. Wilson, we're talking about 5 years, 5 years of concealment. That's not a protective instinct, that's a sustained campaign. Margaret's expression did not change. 5 years of cooking that man's meals, she said. 5 years of washing his clothes and cleaning his house and building his confidence and carrying his child while he spent his Tuesday afternoons at a hotel that her money was paying for. 5 years of being told she was stupid, plain, ungrateful, and worthless by a man who was living inside a life she had constructed for him. She let the quiet hold for a beat. You want to talk to me about who was running a sustained campaign in that marriage, counselor? Because I have a different answer than you do. Judge Martinez was looking at her notepad. Her pen was not moving, the stillness of a judge who is listening with the part of themselves that exists before professional training. Sanchez tried once more from a different angle, the question of the gala itself, the public nature of the reveal, the choice to make it spectacle. Margaret received the question without visible alarm. My granddaughter could have walked into a lawyer's office on any given Tuesday for 5 years and ended that marriage with a phone call. She stayed because she loved him. She stayed because she kept waiting for the man she married to reappear from behind whatever that money and that vanity had built up over him. She paused. When she finally understood he was not coming back, she made sure the people who had been doing business with him and with her resources, whether they knew it or not, understood exactly what they had been dealing with. She did not do it out of cruelty. She did it because silence had protected him long enough. Margaret looked at Sanchez with an expression that contained underneath its surface civility, something that had been earned by decades of watching people mistake patience for weakness. My granddaughter is not the deceiver in this marriage. She is the one who got deceived about who she married. Judge Martinez issued her ruling 40 minutes after closing arguments. The custody petition was denied. The court found no evidentiary basis for a finding of parental unfitness. The respondent's concealment of her financial identity, while legally complex in other proceedings, did not constitute psychological instability or impaired judgment with respect to child welfare. The countersuit for fraudulent inducement was dismissed with prejudice, the court noting that the petitioner's own identity had been legally altered prior to the marriage, and that his claims of victimization were in the court's measured language, difficult to credit in their full scope. The entrapment motion was referred to the federal court as outside family court jurisdiction, but the judge noted for the record that the documented cooperation between the respondent and federal law enforcement over an 18-month period had been entered into evidence and would be available to any reviewing court. As an additional note, Judge Martinez said, her voice carrying the specific flatness of a judge who is making a point while appearing to merely recite facts, the court wished to observe that the petitioner was currently facing federal charges that included forgery of his spouse's signature on a loan application used to fund a property purchased for a third party during the marriage. The court found his characterization of himself as the aggrieved party in this proceeding to be at best incomplete. In the hallway afterward, Laura held Melissa for a long moment without speaking. Melissa, who had cried through the last 15 minutes of the hearing in the careful and controlled way of someone trying not to be seen crying in a courthouse, pressed her face against Laura's shoulder and held on. Margaret came through the door behind them, moving with her cane, and patted Laura firmly on the hip. "Now can we get lunch? Justice makes me hungry, and those chairs are terrible for my back." Anthony Wilson was near the exit coat already on. He caught Laura's eye across the hallway and gave her a nod, brief, professional, the acknowledgement of one person to another that a thing has been done correctly. She nodded back. There was nothing more that needed to pass between them. That night, Laura slept 12 consecutive hours. The sleep had a quality she did not have a precise word for, not merely rest, but something more like the body's reclamation of its own interior. The return to herself of things she had been pouring outward for years without replenishment. She dreamed about her father. Joseph Davis, in his garage on a Saturday afternoon, bent over an engine block looking up when she came through the side door, the look of uncomplicated pleasure he'd always had when she appeared, as if her presence was a thing that improved whatever room she walked into simply by happening. He said something she couldn't quite hear through the membrane of the dream, but his expression said it more clearly than words would have that she had done what needed doing and that the rest of it was hers to choose. She woke at 7 in a house that felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately locate, like a place she had chosen to be rather than a place she was contained within. The weeks that followed had a texture different from anything in the preceding 5 years. Kenneth reported that the federal case against Brian was proceeding with the momentum of a prosecution that has documentation at every level and a cooperating witness whose 18 months of careful record-keeping has left almost no room for reasonable doubt. Ronald Sanchez was negotiating, which in Kenneth's experience meant that the defense had done the arithmetic and found it did not work in their favor. The shell company architecture was being methodically dismantled, every asset traced back to its Meridian Group origin, and recorded in a ledger that Gary Young had described with his characteristic understatement as comprehensive. 3 weeks after the hearing, Laura drove to Dayton. She did not announce it as a milestone. She simply called Margaret and said she was coming, and Margaret said she would make the guest room ready, and that there was a casserole in the freezer from the church ladies that had been there since September, and that Laura should not feel obligated to eat it. Laura packed what she needed in the Civic, still the same dented Civic, because she had never replaced it, which she had always found funny in a private way, and drove west through the gray December landscape of the Ohio state line and into Dayton, and pulled up in front of the house on Grafton Avenue. As the last thin light of the afternoon was settling into the dogwood trees in the front yard. The house was the same house it had always been, the same porch, the same window boxes that Margaret planted with impatience every May and cleared out every October, the same screen door that stuck in the lower left corner because the frame had shifted years ago and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it. Joseph Davis had grown up in this house. Laura had spent summers here and some of the best days of her childhood and a few of the worst ones, and it smelled both like the cedar closets and Margaret's particular perfume and the cast iron pan that had been seasoning on that stove since before Laura was born. Margaret had coffee waiting. They sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered in the way of people who have known each other long enough that the relationship doesn't require maintenance, only presence. Melissa came to visit on a Saturday in late February, driving up from Bridgeport with a trunk full of baby supplies, a dish she described as a casserole, but which was actually more of a structural experiment involving pasta and 3 kinds of cheese and a bottle of sparkling cider because she announced they were going to toast properly this time, even if it killed them both. She and Laura sat on Margaret's porch in the winter afternoon light, cold enough to see their breath, warm enough in the direct sun to be comfortable if you had a good coat. And Clara was asleep on Laura's chest, her face turned sideways, one small fist curled against her mother's collarbone. Clara Margaret Ashby had arrived on a morning in late January, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with the immediate and forceful opinion about the world that Laura had suspected she would have. The name had come easily, Clara for clarity, for the quality of light on a good morning for the Eleanor Roosevelt Association that Laura had held in her mind since the pregnancy, and then set aside because it felt too pointed, replacing it with something that carried its own weight without needing the reference. Margaret for the woman who had held the cast iron skillet and the witness stand with equal steadiness, who had looked at a federal court and told the truth in a way that left no room for any other interpretation. The birth itself had been the loudest and most clarifying experience of Laura's life. Margaret had been in the delivery room, not technically permitted, but she had walked in and sat down, and nobody on the nursing staff had found the internal courage to ask her to leave, which Laura later thought was one of the better decisions those nurses had ever made. Melissa had held Laura's hand through every contraction, and at the peak of the hardest one had been obliged to say with the professional candor of a pediatric nurse who values her own dexterity, "I need that hand back, Laura. I work with needles." Kenneth had joined by video from Philadelphia, the time difference irrelevant, because he had been awake anyway, and when Clara arrived screaming and perfect, he had removed his glasses and pressed a folded handkerchief to the corner of his eye in a gesture so understated it was almost invisible, which was entirely in character. Now, on the porch in February, Melissa poured cider into 2 mismatched glasses from Margaret's cupboard and lifted hers. "Full rundown, go!" Laura took a sip. Brian was sentenced last month. 8 years federal. No parole eligibility for the first 5. The bail violation from the break-in added another 14 months. The judge was not sympathetic to the argument that he had been under emotional duress. "Good," Melissa said, with the simplicity of someone stating a fact about weather. "Ashley." Laura looked at the dogwood trees at the edge of Margaret's yard. The branches were bare in February, but she knew what they looked like in April when the white flowers came in, and she found herself thinking about that, instead of thinking about the answer, using the image of the April branches to give herself the half-second she needed to locate her own clarity on the subject. She had her baby, a boy. She named him James. She accepted a plea agreement, 6 months probation, 180 hours of community service. She's moved back to her parents' house in Indiana. Melissa raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I set up a trust fund for him," Laura said. "Anonymous, enough for college and whatever comes after." Melissa stared at her for a moment that went on long enough to be notable. "You're serious?" That child did not choose his parents, Melissa. He didn't ask for any of this situation. He deserves a chance to become something that has nothing to do with how he started. She shifted Clara slightly on her chest, the baby making a small adjusting sound without waking. I know what it costs to grow up without enough people in your corner. I'm not going to make James Russo pay for his father's choices. Melissa was quiet for a moment. Then, you are a significantly better person than I am, Laura Clark. No, Laura said. I'm a mother. It's a different thing. The question of what justice actually feels like, what it feels like when you've finally arrived on the other side of it, was something Laura had thought about in the weeks leading up to the gala, with the specific anticipation of a person who believes they know what a destination looks like before they've been there. She had imagined satisfaction as something that would arrive and stay, like furniture, like a fact about the room that would simply be true from that point forward. What actually happened was more complicated and more human than that. There had been satisfaction, she would not pretend otherwise, and she would not apologize for it. Watching Brian's face in the moment of recognition, watching the room see him as he actually was, watching the borrowed architecture of his life get taken apart in public with the same systematic care he had never once applied to anything of hers that had been real and powerful, and she had felt it fully. She had earned the right to feel it fully. But it had not lasted. The satisfaction had dissolved within hours, leaving behind something she hadn't anticipated, a kind of grief, sharp-edged and specific for the years she could not reclaim, for the woman she had been at the beginning of them, for the faith she'd had in that coffee shop on a Wednesday morning when a man had jogged across the street to help a stranger, and she had decided, with the whole unarmed trust of someone who had not yet been taught to protect herself from her own hope, that he was the answer to the question her grandmother had told her to ask. What healed was not the gala. The gala had been necessary. But what healed was the porch and the cider and Clara's weight on her chest and Melissa's voice giving her the full rundown of everything she'd been holding at arm's length for days. What healed was being known completely by people who had seen her at the worst of it and had not recalibrated their opinion of her downward. Her grandmother, who had never once suggested that her granddaughter's pain was her own fault, even when she must have seen from the outside how much of it was preventable. Melissa, who had answered every late-night call for 5 years and had maintained her position without wavering. Kenneth, who had built the architecture of her protection and maintained it with impeccable discretion and cried at the birth of her daughter. Anthony, who had understood immediately what she was dealing with and had helped her turn the evidence of it into something a court could act on. She had not needed $1 billion to survive. She had needed people who did not require her to be anything other than what she was. Margaret came out onto the porch with a tray bearing 3 glasses of sweet tea and a plate of cookies she had baked that morning. She moved at her own pace, cane in hand, and settled into the old rocking chair with the practiced ease of someone returning to a position they have occupied so many thousands of times it has become an extension of the body. She looked at Clara, asleep on Laura's chest, and something moved across her face that was too layered to name love, certainly, and sorrow certainly, and something that was probably closest to gratitude, the specific gratitude of a grandmother who has lived long enough to see a family's next iteration arrive and be intact. "Your daddy would have loved this little girl," Margaret said. "I know," Laura said. "I just wish I hadn't spent 5 years the way I did Grandma, 5 years on a man who was never actually there." Margaret rocked slowly. The winter light came through the bare trees in long angles. "Baby, those 5 years gave you Clara. And they gave you proof. Proof you carried out of that house yourself. Proof that you can walk through the kind of fire that burns people down to nothing and come out the other side holding a new life. That's not waste. She looked at her granddaughter directly. That's a miracle. The expensive kind. Melissa raised her cider glass. Also, and I say this with full love, you are a billionaire with a beautiful baby, and your grandmother is sitting next to you with cookies she made from scratch this morning. Your life is not a tragedy. It is a comeback story. Someone should write it down. The Atlantic Profile ran in March a long-form piece by a journalist who had spent 6 weeks talking to Dr. Sandra Anderson, to Melissa, to the neighbors in Greenwich, who had heard raised voices through the wall on a Tuesday night and said nothing because the neighborhood did not operate that way, to the waitresses at Harlow's Bistro, who had watched Laura arrive for morning shifts with red eyes and a composure that had always seemed in retrospect like something being held together with an effort that left marks. The piece was not about a billionaire's revenge. It was about a woman who had been diminished so slowly she had not noticed the extent of it until she was standing in a parking lot in the rain, watching her husband touch another woman with a tenderness he had apparently been saving for someone else. The comments were not all kind, but enough of them were, and the ones that weren't had stopped surprising her. On an October morning 6 months later, Laura stood on a small stage in a community center in northwest Dayton, 3 blocks from Mel's Diner, 8 blocks from the house on Grafton Avenue, in a neighborhood she had ridden her bike through every summer until she was 15. The building had been a rec center in a previous life and still smelled faintly of rubber flooring. The chairs were folding chairs. The sound system periodically produced a feedback whine that made everyone in the room wince simultaneously, and someone had taped a hand-lettered banner to the wall behind the stage that read, in blue marker on white poster board, "Welcome to the Ashby Foundation." She was not wearing the midnight blue dress. She was not wearing the Ashby blue necklace, which was back in its velvet case in a safety deposit box in downtown Dayton. She was wearing a simple charcoal dress, and her father's watch cleaned and polished, its second hand moving with the quiet, patient regularity of something built to last. The room was full of women, not socialites, not industry contacts, not the curated guest lists of events organized around the performance of philanthropy. These were women from Dayton and from Springfield, and from the smaller towns between them, mothers who had left with nothing. Women who were still trying to find the nerve, women who had been told so many times that they were too small and too stupid and too difficult to love, that they had begun to organize their lives around the assumption that this was factually true. They had come because the Foundation's outreach team had called the shelters and the legal aid offices and the community health centers, and because word had moved through the networks that connect women who are trying to survive to one another in the way that water moves, finding every available path. Clara was in Melissa's arms in the front row, dressed in a yellow onesie, thoroughly occupied with the ear of a stuffed elephant that she had recently discovered was the correct size and texture for serious oral investigation. Margaret sat beside them in her wheelchair. She had accepted the chair in September with the pragmatic acknowledgement of someone for whom dignity has never depended on appearing capable of things. She wasn't wearing her church hat, and an expression of such concentrated pride it was almost indistinguishable from ferocity. Laura looked at the room. She took one breath that she allowed herself to feel fully, the cold October air coming through the heating vents, the smell of the industrial coffee someone had made in an urn in the back, the particular quality of attention that a room full of people pays when they believe something important is about to be said to them personally. "I'm not here as the Meridian Group," she said. "I'm not here as a billionaire. I'm here as a woman who stayed too long with a man who treated her like she was invisible." She paused, not for effect, because the next part required her to locate the words in the right place inside herself before she spoke them. "I had resources most people in this room don't have. I had money, I had lawyers, I had a security team, and a forensic accountant, and a former federal agent who knew how to build a case that would hold up in court." A small sound from the audience recognition, or the beginning of it. "And I had a 78-year-old grandmother with a cast-iron skillet who is sitting in the front row right now and who would like everyone here to know she is available." The laughter that came was warm and immediate and genuinely knowing. The laughter of people who understood exactly what a grandmother with a cast-iron skillet represents in the specific vocabulary of women who have needed someone to show up. "And it was still the hardest thing I have ever done," Laura said, and the laughter settled back into silence. "Not because I lacked the means, because I lacked the belief. I had stopped believing I deserved better. He had spent 5 years telling me I was small, and at some point, and I cannot tell you exactly when, because that's how it works. That's precisely the insidious nature of it. I had started to organize my life around the assumption that he was right." She found Melissa in the front row. Melissa nodded once, with the steadiness of someone who has been holding that nod in reserve for years. "So I cannot imagine, I genuinely cannot fully imagine how much harder this is for the women in this room who are fighting without those resources, without the safety net, without the exit that money makes possible, and that is why this exists." She described the programs clearly without the softening language of institutional philanthropy. Free legal representation from attorneys who specialized in domestic violence cases and family court proceedings, emergency housing with no intake paperwork requirements, job training in fields that paid livable wages and had actual labor market demand, child care subsidized to zero for women in transition, a counseling network staffed by clinicians who had been selected specifically because they had personal experience with the dynamics they were being asked to treat, and a 24-hour phone line answered by human beings, not recordings, not bots, who had been trained to listen first and advise second, because Laura had learned in her own worst hours that what she had needed before she needed advice was simply to have someone on the other end of the line who did not require her to already know what to do. "This foundation exists," she said, "to make sure that walking away doesn't mean walking into nothing. It means walking into a future, your future, and you deserve one, not someday, not after you've arranged everything, not once you've made it safe for everyone around you. No, you deserve it right now." The applause that followed was not like the applause in the Harlow Hotel ballroom. That applause had been the response of 500 people witnessing a spectacle they would describe at dinner parties. This was something that came from a different place entirely, the sound of people in a room being told something they needed to hear, and recognizing it at the cellular level, the particular noise of relief arriving in a place that had been holding its breath. Laura stepped off the stage. Clara, from Melissa's arms, tracked her with the absolute concentration of a 4-month-old who has identified the person who means food and warmth and safety, and has no interest in being separated from her a moment longer than necessary. She reached both arms outward with the uncomplicated authority of someone who knows what she wants and has not yet learned to moderate the wanting of it. Laura took her, held her against her chest, felt Clara's fist close immediately around a strand of hair as if staking a claim, and pressed her mouth to the top of her daughter's head. Margaret wheeled up beside them. "Your father would be proud of you today, baby girl." "I hope so, Grandma. I know so." A pause, in which Margaret's expression suggested she had said what needed saying and was now prepared to move forward. "Now take me to the car. I'm tired, and those chairs were designed by someone who has never sat in one." Laura's phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Kenneth. "Dallas partnership finalized. Board extends. Congratulations. Additionally, your grandmother telephoned my office this morning and requested that I bring proper tea biscuits during my next visit. She specified the ones with chocolate. She also specified 2 boxes. Shall I confirm?" Laura typed back, 3 boxes. She's earned it. Don't be late." She carried Clara out through the community center's double doors and into the October afternoon. The air hit them both sharp and cold, and smelling of fallen leaves and the particular quality of light that belongs to autumn in Ohio, when the sky goes a specific shade of blue that looks like it was mixed by someone who was trying very hard to get it right. Melissa came through the doors a moment later, pulling her coat closed, and fell into step beside her. Margaret followed the wheels of the chair, moving steadily over the cracked sidewalk, her commentary on the landscaping choices of the building's management beginning immediately and continuing with the focus of an expert who has been storing up observations. There is something nobody tells you about the woman who survives the humming that was supposed to break her, about what she looks like when she comes out the other side and keeps going. They tell you about the strength. They tell you about the resilience, that word so overused it has been worn smooth, like river stone. What they don't tell you is how ordinary the aftermath is. How it looks like a woman walking out of a community center in Dayton, Ohio, on an October afternoon with a baby on her hip and her best friend beside her, and her grandmother critiquing the begonias somebody had let die in the window box by the front entrance. How it looks like just a life, an ordinary, chosen, fully inhabited life. Clara pulled the strand of hair she had been holding and made a sound of great satisfaction, as if this had been the experiment and the results had confirmed her hypothesis. Laura adjusted her grip and kept walking toward the car, where the rest of the afternoon was waiting, ordinary and sufficient, and hers. Was Laura right to wait until the gala, or should she have walked away years before, quietly, without the stage and the cameras and the 500 witnesses? There's no clean answer to that question, and the discomfort of not having one is maybe exactly the point. It makes you wonder how often we ask women to choose between their survival and our comfort with the way they chose to survive. If this story reached something in you, if you saw someone you know in Laura, or someone you've been, or someone you're still trying to become, drop a comment and tell me. Was the gala the right move, or should she have walked away in silence? I want to hear where you land on it, because there's no wrong answer. There's only the truth of what you've seen and what you know, and what you would do with 5 years of patience finally running out.